Good morning, all. This is a meeting of the Policy Review Committee. And November 10th, 2022. And call the meeting to order and have a roll call
Chair Brown,
here.
Vice Chair Cole, Dr. Pierce, Joellen Klein, Francis Beasley here, Kelsey Ellingson here, Jared Holt. We have three, and that does not reach a quorum, Chair Brown.
Okay. Well, then we'll go ahead and get started with the discussion. The discussion of some of these policies without a quorum. It won't be official. We won't be able to vote. But we can have some discussion. And if the record could also reflect that we have James Barnes and Bill Hayes with us in person. And I don't know who all is on with us virtually, but we'll get to that. Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay, folks, we will skip ahead to item 3.01, the revised middle and high school determination of grades policy. And we have Greg Wisniewski here to discuss those changes.
And actually, Dr. Klein is here with us as well, and I think she wanted to lead it off, so I'm going to turn to Dr. Klein on that.
I'm sorry, Dr. Klein, I couldn't see you on the screen.
Oh, no worries at all. Greg did all the work. So, Chairman Brown, the reason that we felt that it was important to bring this policy to you for quite some time now is because it does not reflect the past contract that we updated with regard to interim grades, because we do not do interim grades. There are also some other changes that we felt were important that we would like to proceed with. And Mr. Greg Wisniewski, our Director of Information Management, who runs our student information management system, has made those, and we would like to present them to you today. Greg?
Certainly. So looking at the proposed policy changes here, we see that on the first page, at the bottom of the first page, we are striking the word interim. As Dr. Klein had mentioned in previous contracts, we have actually removed the interim grading process. And so this is just bringing the policy up to date with those procedural changes that have already taken place as part of the contract. Additionally, we are looking at replacing some terms, and there are actually 3 additional changes that you don't see on the agenda item that we are proposing. Just this actually came after conversation with Mr. Hayes, our CA Vice President, when he was calling to ask about the use of the word term. And where we find the word quarterly in this document, we are actually looking at replacing that with the word term. The word term more closely matches the student information system where the grades are housed and reported from. And we're trying to make sure that we are aligning the language in the policy with the technical language in the student information system to try to remove any confusion or any ambiguity as to where the policy applies to practice. As we continue on, we see that we strike the section fully that speaks of interim grades. There's no changes in the actual quality points scale or scores or the reference tables that are associated with those. An additional change that is aligning the policy with the language that's within Infinite Campus is where we see the word classes or class. We are changing that to the word courses or course. And that is because the grade itself, is attached to the course and is assigned to the course. A class is really the group of individuals, or the classroom is the space. So again, just trying to align those. And then finally, we've made some changes to the language when it talks about the calculations in order to have a policy that is flexible to be able to represent the variability that we find with courses. Instead of predefining the divisors by saying we're dividing by 9 or dividing by 5 or dividing by 4, we're using language such as the sum of double the total terms in which the course was offered plus 1. That way, if a course is offered across 3 terms, the divisor could be calculated through the policy as 7 and so forth. Again, just trying to give that flexibility as we continue on. with how education options are offered to students in the district. We want to make sure that the policy is able to address all of the courses and the way in which those educational options are being offered. And that's pretty much the totality of the recommended changes.
Thank you, Greg. I do want to add one thing that's very important. We had some confusion from our staff members when we went from whole year courses to semesters not that long ago. Remember that if they are doing a semester course, so Algebra X, for instance, which is first and second term, then please remember that it is up to the teacher whether or not they assign a final exam. So that's where Greg was talking about the divisors for quality points is very, very important, because you would double the first term, double the second term, and add 1 for the final exam. But if there is no final exam given, it is very important that the teachers understand that it's okay to double the first, double the second, and change the divisor. So that's why that language was fixed, to bring more clarity for our teachers. And Mr. Hayes, thank you for calling Greg and clarifying.
Great, that's all of it. Thank you. Any questions? I don't have questions, and Bill? That's good. Because of the, I think the timing and the importance of getting this to the board fairly soon, what I'd like to do is simply present it to the board at the next meeting. The board can make that decision. While we can't have a recommendation because we don't have a quorum, I can relate to the board that we've all had a chance to look at this policy and approve, individually recommend the board passing it. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Oh, very good. We'll do that. What's next up?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Brown. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Mr.
This will
Hayes.
be on the next board meeting agenda.
All right, with that, we can move on to what was 3.02, and all these next points are discussions of the positive behavior and intervention and support and restraint and seclusion policy. This policy has been on our books at CCS since 2015 in the form that it appears today. There have been significant changes to the rule that relates to this in law. Those changes were made in 2021. And ODE at that time updated their model policy with regard to this. I believe that we are doing the work in line with those updated rules. However, our policy is out of date and we need to bring that up to speed at this point as well. What I've presented to you, because the significance of the changes that were made, was I gave you a copy of what Neola, our policy provider, had to do basically in a markup to make those changes to their template. And that is really just informational to show you how significant those changes were. What I've presented after that is essentially the Neola template, the up-to-date current template on PBIS and restraint and seclusion. And then a second option, which is a different style, but the content in essence is the same, that is more in the style of OSBA, which is the other main policy provider in Ohio. I have some folks from our staff, I see Tricia, that has been working with me on this. Do you care to add anything from your perspective in the work that you do day to day?
Thanks, Kyle. I think both of the suggested policy updates that we have examples for both clearly outline the framework that we are currently using for Columbus City Schools in alignment with the current law. And we are doing all of the practices that are listed. I think one just goes into greater detail about what those practices are and the framework that we use. I think the abbreviated option also works well. The only thing that I saw that was a difference between the two is the professional development provided to staff. For all staff needs to be done every 3 years. That 3-year indicator is left out of the shorter policy. But other than that, I think they both work really well.
Thank you.
Yes, were you all able to review, prior to the meeting, any of these options? Do you have any thoughts? Or questions that we can?
I'll just admit that when I read the first kind of track change one from Neola, but then looking at the unmarked version of 1 and 2, I knew I was gonna need your help to understand what the differences between them would be. So I think you touched on that. Anything more you have to say would be good. And I think the only other thing I was hoping for this morning was just more contextual or situational information about what are the things that are happening in the classrooms that make what's happening on this page relevant. Because as you read it, it's the fact that these things happen isn't news to me, but it's a little startling to read the specifics of what staff are allowed to do or might be called to do, and how you balance that against protecting folks who might be misbehaving or having a hard time while bringing call back. So I just wanted to hear more about the applied version of this and what's happening.
Okay, I'll speak first to kind of the revisions. The first round of this rule done by the State Board of Education was in 2013. So there was a period of time in between that and this revision. This revision was pretty significant. It added definitions. It added a new complaint process to ODE versus just to the school district. It added particular parameters around professional development and training for staff. It revised the PBIS framework to some extent and put a lot more information in the rule on that than there was before. And it also added some information about where if there's multiple incidents involving the same student, and that trigger is 3, that those situations have to be handled a certain way and certain things need to be done. So those are some of the, the changes, as you can see from the markup, are significant. The differences in the 2 policy styles that I gave you, substantively, they're essentially covering the same thing. They're both targeting this rule. The Neola version is very much modeled after the ODE model policy, which was released very closely after the rule changed. It's really more stylistic between the 2 versions. So I think, Tricia, I would leave it to all of you about the preference between the 2. I just wanted to give you some options. I think, I believe John is on here as well as Tricia. I'm not sure if Jeff is here, but would you all be able to speak to some of her questions, please?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. What are your, I guess, exact questions, or what are your specific questions about what's going on?
So I think it, just like a general response to that, this committee is handed policies and we can read what's on the page in front of us, but sometimes having a background understanding of the urgency or relevance around why these need to be updated and what's happening in schools every day is just helpful to root us as we are asked to make decisions or recommendations about what's needed. So I guess in terms of how, I guess, can you give me an example of how seclusion is used and how staff use that to de-escalate?
Yes, I am John Brunton. I am CPI coordinator for the district.
Can we get a little bit more volume?
From your end or mine?
I think we're doing it from our end.
Okay. Because I've got you guys all the way up on mine to hear you, so.
Much better, thank you.
Okay. So in 2013, when this became Ohio Revised Code for every school system, in the wording of the original procedure that came out, it talked about not only having a process for PBIS to be proactive, but then when things went askew, what was the district going to do? At that time, there were a lot of issues with districts looking at not only physical controls and seclusion, but seclusion rooms and places that students were put when they were having issues. So the state came up with this Ohio Revised Code. We as a district then followed suit. So what we do, and I know it says every 3 years for PBIS, but in our district, we train in CPI and seclusion every year. We use CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute, for verbal de-escalation and physical controls. In that, we train every year. We train approximately 3,000 people, 3,000 staff in this district every year for CPI. We talk about the seclusion portion of it, which according to the state definition and the former district policy is if a child is physically trying to leave an area and we as staff are physically preventing them from doing so. So in talking about that, it could be something as simple as a teacher standing in the doorway of the classroom. If the child just wanders around, that is not considered seclusion. That is classroom management. I am standing in the doorway to prevent it from happening. When a student physically pushes on that staff member or physically tries to get through the door, then that becomes seclusion if a staff member is preventing them from leaving it. We talk about it when we're training that could be in any situation. It might be a student trying to leave the building and an administrator is standing in the doorway to keep them from leaving. A few years ago, we had an issue where an administrator was trying to keep a kid in the cafeteria to prevent them from going after another student. There were 4 or 5 other doorways, but that student chose to continue to try and get out that particular doorway through that particular administrator. So we often talk about the mental aspect of the students during these situations for both physical controls and seclusion, and how they're behaving, what they're doing, how they've lost rationality at this point in time. In both seclusion and the physical controls, we talk about last resort, meaning that this is the end of anything. We have, as a district, looked at 3 different things that would be a last resort. We talk about that they're a danger to themselves or others. We talk about that all verbal de-escalation has ceased to work. And we talk about that the child being put into seclusion or into a control is less problematic than the behavior that the child is doing at the time. That kind of help?
Yeah, it does. I have another question, but I want to leave room for others. Ask questions.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Anybody else have a question? Bill, anything?
Not yet.
Okay. Go ahead.
So and the other thing that was occurring to me as I was reading this was I don't have the most up-to-date information on how the district is approaching security or safety personnel being in your buildings, typically through contract or historically it's been special duty with City of Columbus. And I know that there's one reference to law enforcement in here about when things do truly escalate and they're needed. But as this policy applies to staff, are those you asked to be in your buildings, like security forces of any type, safety forces, also trained to respond this way? Or how does this apply to them and your expectations of them?
John, were you able to hear that?
Yeah. In our district, safety and security are also trained in CPI to deal with these situations to help out in building. Some of the wording in the policy and in the Ohio Revised Code talks about a team at the building level. We refer to them as student support team. Members of that team are to be trained in CPI to be able to deal with physical controls. I know in the past that some members of CPD have been trained in CPI, but unfortunately, I don't know if that's continued. And since there have not been as many SROs in buildings as in the past, I don't know if that's something that they still continue with. But again, like I say, we do have safety and security. They are trained in CPI also to be able to deal with that. In the past, if a CPD or an SRO have become involved, typically the building staff has then kind of has become hands-off and has stepped away from the situation. Franklin County Children's Services, many of their staff who come out and investigate or talk with staff, they are also trained in CPI. So we are using the same words when a situation does arise. But as far as CPD and outside agencies, I'm not really sure how they are involved with us anymore.
Thank you.
I had a question about how much parental involvement or intervention is placed into the seclusion and restraint.
Did you all hear that question?
Oh, I'm sorry. How much parental involvement?
According to the policy that we currently have and with the new revised information or the new revised Ohio Revised Code that came out in 2019, it is we are required to make all information available to parents within 24 hours. Now, as a district, when our policy came out in 2015, we said it needed to be given to the parents within 24 hours. The state did not have a qualifier on that until this reissuance. So we were actually kind of guided ODE in that fact that they came up. They are now also saying within 24 hours that all information must be provided to the parent. Currently, there is a format on Infinite Campus where a staff member fills out the paperwork, the incident report form, and a debriefing format, which is also in the wording of the law. And then that is, once it's closed, it does go to parent portal for the parent to be able to see that. We as a district also, when we're teaching CPI and the seclusion portion, we make it very well known that the staff needs to contact the parent or at least make valiant effort to contact the parent by phone to let them know all of this has happened, either a seclusion or a physical control. Parents we do try and keep them involved and in the loop. When we start looking at the fact that after 3 incidences of either seclusion or a control, you must start working on a functional behavior assessment and a behavior plan, again, according to the reissuance. Parents are then contacted and we try very hard to get them involved in the writing of the behavior plan, whether they're working on the functional behavior assessment or a function finder, to try and come up with why the students are doing that particular behavior. And then again, we also reveal back to the proactive portion of this with PBIS.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hey, John, this is Phil Hayes. How are you?
I'm doing well, and you?
Pretty good. So I have a question for you. Have you had a chance to look at these different versions of the policy?
I have looked through them. In 2019, I was on the committee with ODE that looked at doing the revisions to do the reissuance. Trisha, Jeff, and Kyle and I met for a little bit yesterday afternoon to talk about the differences. I realized that we're trying to scale things down and use less words on a policy, and I appreciate that fact. But to me, the best part about this reissuance of this Ohio Revised Code was the fact that we gave much more information and much more bigger teeth, basically, to the PBIS portion of this. So I am a bit concerned that if we try and whittle it down too far, are we getting rid of important information for both PBIS and the backbone for doing the physical controls and the seclusion.
So okay, so if you had your way, which one would we pick?
I would go with, I think it's the Neola. Is that the one that's a little bit more comprehensive and gives more information? That to me would be the one that would be more important. Like I say, the differences between 2015 and 2021 were huge in the fact that after we had been doing this Ohio Revised Code for a few years, ODE really sat down and looked at it was being much more reactive and talking about all of the seclusion and the physical controls and not giving the credit to being proactive with PBIS. So I would be very concerned that if we tried to whittle this down too far, that very important wording about PBIS and very important wording about the controls and the seclusions and when we do it and what needs to happen afterwards, I would be afraid we would scale it down a little too far.
Thanks.
That's helpful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, did you have anything? Did you have a follow-up question?
You know me, I'm a fountain of questions. I think the only thought that remains for me after your helpful explanation for about engagement with law enforcement, and as I was reading, as I should be able to find, there are references to age appropriate interactions. And I just think that it certainly isn't laid out in this policy, but it should be made clear to anyone, I forget what you call it, a care team or support staff, the security forces you bring in, what that actually means. I know that law enforcement gets a lot of crisis intervention training these days, but who knows how much it aligns with what you request of staff and what that looks like in this very special and careful setting. So I would just urge another look to ensure alignment there, but I appreciate the explanation.
When you're asking about age and all that, one of the things that we do look at very carefully, and on our incident report form, we even talk about that if a child is put into a seclusionary situation or put into a control, that for every minute of year of age, at the very least, there is communication with that child, checking on their mental and physical state. So that was one of the concerns we as a team in looking at all of this initially, that we had that concern. How long do you proceed with these situations? So we do have in there a qualifier that for every year of age, a minute of time, you must check on that student, whether you're holding them, you're standing in front of them. So if a child is 9 years old, at least every 9 minutes, a staff member must ask the child how they're doing. In most situations, in going through all the incident reports, that is part of my job here, they're going through them they're talking to the students constantly, or they're in the room with them constantly, or standing in front of them constantly. So it is working very well in that aspect. The other thing that we put in as a district that was not in either of the policies was talking about what interventions were used prior to a control or seclusion being used. That is on the incident report form. Again, hearkening back to how can we better use PBIS and how can we better be proactive when dealing with these situations.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And with respect to safety, security, and law enforcement and SROs, it's my understanding that we currently have no contract with the city, that there are no SROs whatsoever, and that our safety and security forces have been significantly expanded to be able to provide those services in the buildings, and trained and are handling things well. It's not to say there won't be further changes in the future. I have no idea. But at least for several years now, we have not had SROs and, so there's no concern. So when CPD comes in as law enforcement, when we call them, you know, they follow their own procedures
Yeah.
and they've had training as well, so. Aside from those things, what's anybody's pleasure? Based on, you know, what I heard from John, my own inclination is brevity is a good thing. But I think the explanation I heard, and the recommendation I heard, I think is important. And that it therefore does make sense to go with the Neola version. It also gives us the advantage that Neola will defend the policy for us, whereas if we don't go with their version, they don't have to do that. Do I have that right?
That's correct. If you change their language substantially, which could be even a sentence, if it's a sentence of substance, they will take a different position on defending the policy.
Right.
Than if you leave it as it is.
Anybody have other thoughts on which way we go?
We're in alignment with yours.
All right, everybody in agreement? Yeah. Any reason not to go ahead and present this one to the board as well? Same fashion, without an official recommendation of the committee, but
I only think about who's not here and I think that they tend to really want to dig into topics such as these. So that's my only hesitation.
That would be the hesitation. I mean, there's so many not here,
right.
especially before.
I would imagine that the board members that aren't here will get the board briefing backgrounder ahead of time.
Correct.
Have the opportunity to answer questions or ask questions, right?
Right,
And,
absolutely.
And I feel for the colleagues who are here that are not board members, but they can always give board member Brown a call and find out what put down or watch this on TV. That's my thought.
But I think, yeah,
Some people who I'm thinking of are board members, so.
Yeah,
That
that's
makes
who
sense.
I was thinking of.
given who those are, yes. I can, when I present this to the board, if I do that at the next meeting, explain to the board that we did not have a quorum, that those present agreed with, you know, what's being presented and the Neola policy. And let them know your thoughts about digging in deeper and having further discussion if we want to do that. That the committee is certainly willing and able to do that. If the board would like us to have further discussion. But it's the board's prerogative, if it wants to go forward, it can do that.
For my 2 cents, I would say that the board meeting is right around the corner.
Next week,
Next Tuesday,
yes.
so that is a short time frame for potentially the board members to get up to speed. And also, I would want to assure that our staff, who's been so helpful here today, would be available for board questions. So
That makes sense.
I think we need to kind of look at the logistics and see which meeting, we can bring it forward, but which meeting would be best to do that at. I think it's going to take a little work.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And the grades policy, we can go ahead with next week,
I believe so.
and this one will hold
Maybe one more meeting.
one more meeting. I don't know whether we have a scheduled committee meeting before that, probably not.
I'll be close again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, that gives us direction. Anything more?
That's all I have. Anyone?
Wonderful. Well, with that, hearing no objections, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, folks. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you,
Thanks for being
Bill.
here, Bill.
You're welcome.
Nice to meet you in person.